Hello, welcome to our session on understanding income data. This is a short 45-minute long session to help busy policymakers think through their local economy and what interventions would be appropriate. So I'm Megan Streb, I'm Deputy Director of Outreach at the Waltwork Centre for Local Economic Growth. We help to make local growth policy more cost-effective through better use of evidence and evaluation. Today's session is going to focus on how to understand available data on income, and that includes wages. Now, after the presentation, we are going to have a Q&A. Please submit your questions throughout, and then we will come to them after the presentation. Without any further ado, I would like to welcome our Deputy Director of Evidence, Victoria Sutherland.
Thank you, Megan, and welcome everyone. Bear with me just for a second while I share my screen. Hold on. I always feel this is the hardest bit of doing these.
Yeah, all set.
Can I just double check it's not on presenter view, Megan?
No, you're
Okay,
fine.
great.
Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Okay, so today we're going to talk about income. And actually, to be honest, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about income and wages, which is a slightly kind of broader set of indicators. I think because we're at the Waltwork Centre for Local Economic Growth, and because a lot of you will be policymakers, primarily at the local level, working on economic growth, economic development, regeneration remits, I think often what we end up doing is we end up looking at GVA, so the value of the goods and services produced within an economy, or we end up looking at productivity within our local economy. But one of the challenges with doing that is local residents don't necessarily always benefit or fully benefit from the GVA and the productivity within an area. And therefore, it's useful to also look at income, because income is a way of looking at how much money do individuals and households have for both spending and saving. So it's a good complement to looking at things like GVA and productivity, because it allows you to think about your residents as well as the workplaces within your area. So income is the money received by an individual or by a household in a given period of time. So that could be a year, it could be a month, it could be a week. Different bits of data look at these things over different time periods. And income can come from lots of different places. So I think for most of us on this call, the majority of our income will come from our wages. So will come from what our employer pays us for the work that we do. I suspect it's less common for people who are on this call, but I suspect many of us have, family members who are self-employed. So for them, it's the income from their self-employment, regardless of how they take that. They might take some of that as wages, but some of that as dividends, just depending on how they have structured their business. We'll all know people who rely on pension income, whether that's from the state or from the pensions that they accrued through their employment. There's also income from savings and investments. So that's quite broad. That can be, you've got £1,000 in a savings account and it's currently paying 4%. So that means that you get £40 over the course of the year. But it could also be, people who own shares or perhaps getting dividend income, perhaps people who have a share in a family business and are getting some dividends from that. It could be that you have buy-to-let properties, etc. And then the final category that we have is benefits. So there's a couple of implications of the fact that income is quite diverse. So the first one is that it's only partially affected by the performance of the economy. So it isn't the case that just because you had really high GVA or really high productivity, or perhaps no, doing it the other way is better. Just because you have low GVA or low productivity, that's only going to partially tell the story of what your income performance is, because people will have incomes from these other sources, from the pensions, from the benefits, from savings and investments. So when we're looking at income, it's a really good way of understanding how much money our individuals and our households have to spend and to save. But it's too complex to say this is fully a reflection of how well our local economy is doing. The flip side of that is that things like pensions, and so the state pension and benefits are set at the national level. Even when we get to wages, for people that are on the lowest wages, the national living wage sets that kind of lower bound. So actually, income is affected by lots of other things that are happening in the economy, not just how well your local economy is doing. The one other thing that I think is worth thinking about before we go on to kind of think about the data on income is that when we're thinking about a local economy as a whole, rather than an individual household, the other thing that's going to affect your income levels is your population structure and your characteristics of your population. So, for example, if you had a large proportion of your population who were under 16 or under 18 and perhaps over 65, the chances are that your incomes on average across the area as a whole are going to be lower than an area that's got a very large working age population because of the wages that people are earning through employment. If you've got a smaller proportion who are working age, that's being spread out over a larger number of people. But there's also things like population characteristics. So we're looking at income here, but it's worth thinking about wealth. So if you have a population that owns more wealth, then they're going to be able to derive an income from that in addition to the other sources of income that are on this slide. So, things like home ownership can make a difference as well in terms of overall income levels. So the source of data that we're going to look at today is a thing called regional gross disposable household income, okay, which is a bit of a mouthful. Now, you can get this from ONS's website, but actually this is one of the data sets that you can also get from NOMIS. And I always think if something's on NOMIS, it's invariably easier to download the data from there than from the ONS dataset, because basically you're able to select the geographies that you want, select the variables that you want, select the dates that you want, and it just pulls off the data that you want, rather than you having to take the whole data set and then extract the stuff that you're looking for. So I said a minute ago that income is wages, is income from self-employment, income from investments, and pensions, benefits. When they calculate GDHI, they actually have to go into a lot more detail than that, because what you end up with is there are various kind of scenarios where if they didn't kind of think about it in the round and put in different kind of figures, you would end up with kind of things being slightly distorted. Okay, so it looks at not just things like wages, but it also looks at what else does the employer give you. So an example for that would be that they make employer national insurance contributions on your behalf. So it probably doesn't feel like that to you as an individual, but that's actually part of your total remuneration package as an employee. So they include that. Similarly, if you had a job where there was on-site accommodation that you got as an in-kind benefit, that gets counted. Okay. things like if you have an employer kind of defined benefit contribution, I suspect quite a lot of people on this call do, then that's getting counted as part of the resources. The one that I think really kind of throws people off is whether or not you own a house. So they do this thing where if you own a house, they include the imputed rent. That's essentially the rent that you would have to pay if you didn't own that house as part of what goes in. But on the flip side, what gets taken off is mortgage interest. And that's just so that they can kind of make equivalence between those who own their own home and those who are renting their homes, so that we don't end up with distortions. So the other thing that this does is, because it's disposable, what it does is it takes off various taxes and other kind of contributions like national insurance that we all make on the kind of right-hand side here. So when they're saying disposable here, it's like after taxes and benefits have been taken into account, as opposed to how much you've got to spend after, you know, you've paid for your food and your utilities and all your other fixed costs. Okay, so what I've done here is I've pulled off some data for some local authority areas in the southwest. So those of you that came to the session a couple of weeks ago on productivity, these are very much the same geographies. So what we've got is we've got the 3 geographies that are within the West of England Combined Authority area. So that's Bristol, Bath and North East Somerset and South Gloucestershire. And then we've got Swindon, as kind of a city on the kind of M4 corridor between London and Bristol, has lots of kind of multinational companies, so it's kind of really interesting. And then we've got Wiltshire, which is next to Swindon and is a large kind of rural area. And what we've also got is we've got England and South West as kind of the natural comparators to those local authority areas, but we've also got London, because we know that London is the best performing economy across the UK, so we've got it in as a little bit of comparator. So this is gross disposable household income per head, okay? So we've added up the income that everybody makes and then divided it by the number of people within the geographies. What you'll see is that across England as a whole, GDHI per head is about £25,000, okay? If we look at London as the best performing economy, we can see that it's actually about £10,000 higher. So average incomes in London are about 35,000 compared to 25,000 across England as a whole. Southwest, as in aggregate, is generally quite similar to England. It's slightly lower, but not kind of massively. And actually, when we look at Bath and North, when we look at the 5 geographies within the southwest that we're in, there is variation, but it is not a massive variation. So the lowest of all of them is Swindon on about 22,000, and the highest is Bath and North East Somerset on about 27,000 per year per head. So I think that takes us to a point that I think is really important to understand, which is that there is much less disparity in income than there is in GVA or productivity. So what I've done here is I've pulled up a chart from a report that our director, Henry Overman, did with a colleague as part of what was called the Deaton Review. So the Deaton Review was looking at spatial inequalities across the UK and what we could do to address them. And they actually used a slightly different set of measures of income. So the income measures are on the far right. These are box and whisker charts. So basically the line in the middle is the kind of 50% point. The green box takes you to the 25 and the 75%, and then the other 2 lines are the 90 and the 10 and the 90%. And then the dots are kind of anything that's outside the kind of 10 and 90 kind of barriers. So what you can see on the right is household incomes before housing costs and household incomes after housing costs. And what you can see is that actually the variation, so this is relative to Great Britain as a whole. So if you had a figure of 1, you would be at the GB level. The variation is much narrower than it is for GVA per capita, which is the very first box and whisker plot, or productivity, which is the second one. So what you see in particular on GVA per capita and GVA per hour is that you've got quite a few places that are above the kind of 90%, that are massively kind of outperforming the rest of the UK. You just don't see that on income. And that's because it's from this whole mix of different income sources, lots of which are determined at the national level rather than being determined by the performance of the local economy as a whole. So I just think that's a really interesting thing to kind of acknowledge. For that reason, I'm going to go on to look a little bit at wages, because I think wages are more reflective of the performance of the local economy. So wages reflect a number of different factors. So the first one is it's a labour market. So we're looking at demand and supply for labour and the extent to which they are matched or mismatched. So I think something that's worth recognising here is there are lots of different labour markets. If anyone's ever been to anything that we've done on skills before, they'll have kind of heard me say this before. There is no the labour market. There are multiple overlapping labour markets. So we're thinking about labour supply and demand, not just in the local labour market, but thinking about supply and demand in different industries and for different occupations. So obviously, if there is really high demand for labour and if for a particular set of skills, that's normally going to push wage levels up. Okay, so labour supply and demand is one factor. Another important factor is productivity. So this one's a little bit complex. So all else being equal, the higher the productivity your workplaces are, the higher the wages can potentially be. So if you are producing goods and services worth £100 per hour, you're going to be able to pay your staff more than if you're producing goods and services that are only worth £20 per hour. Okay, there's just going to be more money to go towards wages. However, it is not a linear relationship. And the reason for that is that labour is only one of the factors of production. So if you're producing something that requires a lot of machinery or a lot of software, or like the value of the goods and services is very driven by the fact that you've got a lot of design or branding kind of involved, or there's been a lot of research and development, for example, in relation to a pharmaceutical good, then that productivity has to be shared across all of those factors of production. So whilst high productivity is required for high wages, it doesn't necessarily follow that just because you've got high productivity, you're going to see high wages, because it's going to depend on the mix of those different factors of production. There are a bunch of other things that also are going to affect the wages that are paid. So at the bottom level, national minimum wage is going to kind of almost creates a floor in terms of the wages that are paid. But we also see other things. So for example, larger firms tend to pay slightly more for equivalent work than smaller firms do. So you get those kinds of dynamics as well. Again, wage data is available from Office for National Statistics, but it's one of the ones that we can get from NOMIS, so I would always encourage you to get it from NOMIS. I think there's two things that are worth noting here about what data is available. So the first thing is, there's a thing called the Annual Survey of Hours and Earnings, okay? And basically, this is based, the sample of the employers that they go out to survey is based on PAYE data. And what that means is this is wage data, but it's actually only wage data for employees. Self-employed are not included in it, okay? But the other, so I guess that's a downside because we're getting kind of a slightly restricted view of wage rates because we're only looking at employees. The positive is they publish this in two ways. So they publish what's called a resident analysis and a workplace analysis. So what that means is, you know, when you're pulling off a geography, so let's use Bristol as our example, because it's in our charts. When we do the resident analysis, what we are looking at is we're looking at what are the wages that are being paid to people who live in Bristol, okay? Whereas when we do the workplace analysis, we're looking at what are the wages paid to people who work at an employment site in Bristol, okay? And what you'll see in a minute is that we get often quite a different kind of outcome depending on whether we look at the resident analysis or the workplace analysis. Okay, so one of the other good things about annual survey of hours and earnings is that there's lots of different options to choose from within it. So gross just means kind of like total in this particular case pre-tax. So one of the things that you can do is you can choose where to look in the income distribution. Okay, so the obvious thing to do is to look at average. Okay, but when you look at average, you've got two choices. You can either look at the mean or you can look at the median. Okay, so for those that are grasping for what they learned at kind of GCSE maths and forgotten, mean is we add all of the figure, you know, all of the different measures up, and then we divide by the total number of observations that we've got. The median is when we take the case that's bang in the middle, okay? So let's say we had 99 people that we'd collected data for, we would be taking number 50 because it's right in the middle, okay? The reason that you use median when you're looking at wages is that if you use mean, if you have a small cohort of extraordinarily high earners, they will pull your mean up kind of unrealistically. So the obvious example is if you had a local authority area and, you know, you had a bunch of Premiership footballers who lived locally, that's going to pull your mean up because they're earning, you know, often hundreds of thousands of pounds a week. So we go with median. Other things it does, so in this case, we've gone with weekly wages, but we could have done we could have done annual wages. But also we can do things like we can do with overtime or without overtime. We can do kind of basic pay. You know, there are different options that you can. I just think weekly wages is a nice kind of intuitive one to look at. And then the final bit is you get to choose, are we doing total workers? Are we doing full-time workers? Are we doing part-time workers? Are we doing men? Are we doing women? So I've gone with total, like men and women. Although sometimes if you're looking at something where you think perhaps, you know, you need something that's targeted, you might want to look at female earnings compared to male earnings. I do full-time workers rather than total, so full and part-time, because different places will have different proportions of workers who are full-time and workers who are part-time, okay? And I think if you do the total, then that you're beginning to kind of, you can't disaggregate whether the difference is because of the wages that people are earning or that kind of ratio between full and part-time. So I just think doing full-time workers is a good way of kind of looking at how different places are doing. So what we'll see here is we see that London has the highest wages, at least using this measure, both in terms of resident and workplaces. So in terms of people who live in London, on average, they're earning, or at least full-time workers are earning about £900 a week, whereas if we go to people who work in London, it's kind of up, kind of near kind of 960 a week. So I think we can all envisage that for London, can't we? That actually there's lots of people who are going to take quite high paid jobs within London, but that are in commuting. Okay, and if you wanted to look at that in more detail, rather than looking at kind of median weekly wages, what you could do is you could look at, you know, what's the average at the 90th percentile or the 80th percentile. So you could look at kind of like just, you know, what does it look at, like earnings at kind of different levels. If we look at England as a whole, what we see is that it's about the same. So we're getting a similar level of wages for both workplaces and residents in England. And that's because if you think about the size of England, the proportion of people who don't both live and work in England is very small compared to the overall. So it's not surprising that they're very similar. I think it's interesting some of the other places, you know, so Swindon is a place where, again, it's sitting just below the England average, but again, the earnings being earned by residents and in workplaces are very similar, okay? However, that's not true for everyone. So we see that in Bath and North East Somerset, it's got much higher earnings for residents than it has for workplaces. Okay, so what we're most probably seeing here is that there are a lot of people who are living in Bath and North East Somerset and who are taking good, well-paying jobs in other areas and are kind of out commuting to those jobs. But Bath and North East Somerset, because of the nature of that economy, you know, perhaps, you know, like doesn't have as many kind of high value added sectors within its economy. So in particular, I think something that we almost probably know is that Bath is kind of a real kind of tourist destination. And we know that jobs in the tourism industry tend to be towards the bottom of the wage distribution. So that will definitely be kind of skewing it. In contrast, Bristol is a little bit like London in that it's got much higher employment levels in workplaces than it has in its residences. So I think something that's worth thinking about is if you're in this kind of scenario that Bath's in, I think essentially you've got one of two choices. If actually you're quite happy being somewhere that isn't necessarily somewhere where there's a lot of economic activity, but it's a nice place to live and people are able to commute and take well-paying jobs elsewhere, that might be, you know, fine with you. If it's not, then actually most of the interventions that you would want to make would be about growing your local economy. So they're very much about targeting workplaces, so targeting the businesses that are in the area. So they're often going to be things that are around growing employment in high productivity sectors or growing the productivity of your sector. So that could be anything from, you know, supporting businesses to invest, you know, encouraging and supporting workers to upskill, you know, linked to that kind of management leadership skills, you know, actions around innovation, around startup, and actually around inward investment as well. However, if it's the other way, if you've got well-paying jobs, but actually your population's not benefiting from that, your interventions are going to skew much more to how do you support your residents to be able to access those employment opportunities. So that might be about skills, it might be about transport connections, it might be about other things that you need to do to enable them to access work, perhaps childcare interventions, for example. I think this is my last chart. I always think it's super interesting looking at all of these bits of data in isolation, but actually it can also be useful and you'll get additional insights if you pull them together into a single kind of bit of analysis. So what I've done here is I've benchmarked Bristol, Swindon and Wiltshire, so kind of three of the local authorities that we had in our earlier analysis. And I've made them a percentage of the England average. So basically, if they had the same, let's say, income level as England as a whole, the figure that you would get is 100. If their income was about 10% higher, it would be 110. If it was 10% lower, it would be 90 on this, okay? And what I've done is I've put income, wages, so resident wages, workplace wages, and productivity. So I find this super interesting to look at. So like on Wiltshire, what we see in Wiltshire is Wiltshire's productivity is only about 93% of the England average, but its income is 104% of the England average. So we're not deviating massively from England here, but we have this issue where, like, if you just looked at productivity in Wiltshire, you'd think, oh, this is an area that's really underperforming and you would have concerns. But actually, when we look at income, we see that actually people in Wiltshire are doing better than across England as a whole. Now, part of that is about salaries, because we can see that salaries are a bit closer to the England average. In particular, resident wages are a bit closer. So again, we've got a little bit of commuting on. But because income's higher again, what that tells us is people in Wiltshire are benefiting more from some of those other sources of income than other places across England are. So perhaps that is that, you know, people have more savings or more investments that they're able to derive a income from, or maybe there's a little bit of house prices and imputed rent. But Wiltshire's doing okay on income, or at least better than you would expect than if you just look at productivity. Swindon is the complete opposite picture, and really very dramatically so. So Swindon has high productivity, so almost 50% higher than England as a whole. When we look at wages, they're pretty much the England average, but then incomes are below the England average by quite a bit, so they're only at 87%. So what that tells us is we've got really productive firms. People are benefiting in wages, but there's clearly lots of that productivity is having to go to other factors of production, you know, so to research and development, or to machinery, or to other kind of intangible bits of capital. But also it tells us something about the structure of the population in Swindon, that even though wages are okay compared to England as a whole, that actually there must be issues in terms of the population structure that are dragging the income down. So perhaps we've got a higher proportion of people on benefits, or who in retirement are only relying on the state pension or pension credit. So there's clearly something interesting going on there in terms of the population dynamics. And I just think this is interesting to pull them together in this way, because you'll get insights that you don't otherwise get. So one final thing that I want to say in relation to developing kind of policy around this is it's very, very difficult to target wages or income directly. Okay, so nearly always you're trying to achieve this through another goal. So we're increasing productivity and hopefully that'll pull up our wages, or we're trying to get more of our population into work and that's going to pull up our income overall. The real challenge here is this is a complex system and there's lots of different interactions. So it's hard to be certain about the outcomes that you might get. So for example, you could increase productivity within local firms, but actually if that's about the other factors of production, wages and incomes might not go up. It might be that you could get wages to go up, but especially for the lowest earners, if actually they are currently accessing some in-work benefits and their in-work benefits go down as a result of their wages going up, you maybe aren't going to see an increase in household incomes. Or another example of that is, it might be that you manage to get the incomes of an individual within a household up, but what that household decides to do is to reduce the number of hours being worked by another household member to compensate. So it's not, always, a direct improving wages leads to an increase in income. Similarly, if we get more people into work, those people are definitely going to benefit from that movement into work. But something that can happen is if they're moving into minimum wage jobs, then what can happen is that your average wages come down because you're adding people at the bottom, but not more at the top. So they're not kind of offsetting each other. So the median comes down. Similarly, a lot of whether or not you see benefits for your local people in terms of the amount that they've got available to save and spend is going to depend on the commuting patterns that we are observing. So I will finish there. Megan, do we have questions?
Yeah, we do. We have just a couple minutes for questions, about 5 minutes. So I'm going to go first to the one about confidence intervals. So someone has talked about using confidence intervals, particularly when we're looking at a local authority level, because the sample size is quite small and we know that there's some issues. So just maybe a quick point about how to make sure you bring a note of caution into some of particularly looking at employment data.
Yeah, so funnily enough, me and Megan were having a debate about this on Friday. Is is whether or not to put the confidence intervals on. So you'll sometimes see a chart. So like where we had bars, you'll sometimes then see a little kind of black thing that looks like a T, but with like a bar at the bottom as well. And that's where you're showing the confidence intervals. We sometimes do that. I'm always slightly reluctant to do it on something like this because obviously you don't know who's attending and kind of how on grass they're doing. But I think doing that can be really useful because it does help demonstrate what your confidence intervals are. In particular, I think sometimes if you're doing an internal document, it can be really useful. You maybe wouldn't want to do it, in a strategy document where you don't know your readers. I should say that definitely applies for employment rates, ASH, etc. With GBA and productivity, you don't get confidence intervals in the same way. So if you were doing that kind of benchmarking, you would only be able to do it for some of them, not all of them.
I think also part of that point about confidence intervals goes to some of the things that Victoria put in the last slide, just about also kind of managing expectations, particularly when you're maybe talking to people outside of economic development. So that might be local councillors or that might be to other stakeholders. Just making sure that you're really clear about when they're thinking about income, that they understand what may or may not affect it. Right. And I think some of those things that Victoria's raised about commuting, about thinking about the links between wages and bringing more people into work, like a lot of that stuff, it's just really useful to kind of think in the round, what are some of the limits on this data and what are some of the limits of how we talk about this data to others? Okay, we've got a bunch of questions. We're not going to have a chance to answer all of them. I will be looking to answer them on K-Hub, which I will mention very shortly. But there's two that have been about within local authority areas. So what do we do when actually we have a targeted intervention or looking at kind of variation within an area?
Yeah, so the bad news is you can't use either of the data sets that I put up to look at variation within an area. There are other data sets that you can get that are at a smaller level. So, for example, one of the dimensions of the index of multiple deprivation looks at income. It obviously only gets updated every so often, but if you're trying to identify the areas that perhaps have the lowest income, that's a good place to look. I think my question would be, are you trying to identify places where you want to intervene, or do you want to understand the exact, wage levels in an area? So, like, understanding the wage levels is impossible. But if what you're saying is, I think these are the places, I want to know the places where it makes most sense to intervene, in terms of perhaps offering services to local residents. I would use something like the index of multiple deprivation or some of the DWP data that will tell you where benefits claimants are kind of concentrated. I'd use something like that.
Okay, that's super helpful. We are going to leave it there. What I'm going to ask folks to do before you disappear, if you've been in our sessions before, you've probably heard me rattle through things. I'm going to continue to say that for the benefit of folks watching on YouTube. I would invite you at the moment, what topics do you want next? Please put those into the Q&A. So what other things are you grappling with at the moment that you'd like to see us do a webinar on? We are thinking about what webinars to offer later in the spring and in the summer. So please do pop that into the Q&A. And then just a few other things. If you're not on K-Hub, but you do work in local government, please do check out khub.net. From there, you can you register for that. Then you can search for our group, Local Economic Growth in the UK. We coordinate it. It's a chance to speak to other folks working in economic development across the UK, as well as to see some of these questions. So in terms of other resources, our new data analysis guide is on our website, whatworksgrowth.org. Particularly if you are new to data analysis or data presentation, that's really useful. We will also shortly be adding to our website our new guide on productivity, GVA, and income. So that's what this session on income and last session on productivity data are both supporting. So do check out our website. If you've not already signed up for our newsletter, you will find that at the bottom of every page on our website. You will also find it in the signature of my email, because I will soon be sending out a link to this recording as well as to the slides. The recording is on YouTube, as are previous webinars that we've hosted. You'll find some on the live part. You will see some on the videos part. Do look at the breadth of what we've had on offer, which give these short overviews. Do share this with these with colleagues, right? If this is a useful introduction for maybe who's just starting in the team, or if you're having discussions with colleagues in another team, maybe someone in housing or transport would also really benefit from better understanding what data is available on local growth. Otherwise, thank you so much for your time. And we hope to see you in another event. If you haven't added a comment before you disappear, please do add to the Q&A what other topics would you like. And I think that is all from us. Thank you so much.